Last week, police in Milwaukee, Wisconsin released a half-hour video recording that documented police officers accosting the Milwaukee Bucks NBA star Sterling Brown in the parking lot of a Walgreens. What began as a confrontation over a handicapped parking spot transformed into a violent police action that included the tasing and arrest of Sterling Brown. The NBA star announced that he was suing the Milwaukee Police, and he said he was doing it as a way of standing up for people less famous than him.
I get mad every time I watch it, because I was defenseless pretty much. My hands were behind my back and they still, tased me. After that, I'm still on the ground for about 10 minutes, still wet, face to the ground, knee in my neck. Now it's, okay, how do I just get out of this? How do I get home? How do I see my family?
In a statement released by the Bucks, Brown wrote that what should have been a simple parking ticket turned into an attempt at police intimidation, followed by the unlawful use of physical force, including being handcuffed, tased, and then unlawfully booked. Brown continued, "Situations like mine and worse happen every day in the Black community. Being a voice and a face for people who won't be heard and don't have the same platform as I have is a responsibility I take seriously. I'm speaking for Dontre Hamilton of Milwaukee, Laquan McDonald of Chicago, Stephon Clark of Sacramento, Garner of New York, and the list goes on. These people aren't able to speak anymore because of unjust actions by those who are supposed to serve and protect the people." This is the latest incident of famous or high-profile Black professional athletes speaking out after violent run-ins with law enforcement. And it happens at a time when the President of the United States continues his obsession with Black athletes. Most recently, Trump celebrated the white NFL owners forcing through a policy that its players must stand for the national anthem or face penalties from their teams. The NFL can also sanction teams if it's determined that the players aren't being patriotic enough and the teams aren't punishing them.
But still, I think it's good. You have to stand proudly for the national anthem. Well, you shouldn't be playing. You shouldn't be there. Maybe you shouldn't be in the country. You have to stand proudly for the national anthem.
We're going to talk about Trump's obsession with Black athletes and a lot more with our next guest. He is Professor Eddie Glaude Jr. He's the William S. Todd Professor of Religion and African American Studies at Princeton University. He's also the chair of Princeton's Department of African American Studies. Glaude is the author of a number of important books, among them Democracy in Black, How Race Still Enslaves the American Soul, and In a Shade of Blue, Pragmatism and the Politics of Black America. We mentioned Professor Glaude recently on this show after this important intervention on MSNBC regarding the Israeli massacre of Palestinian protesters in Gaza.
All of that's important, and all of those babies are dead. All of those people are dead. They're dead. And we're talking about racehorses. The politics. There are a lot of folks who are dead today. For what? I'm sorry. This is me being a moralist, I suppose.
No, I understand. And the White House.
Well, he does not pull punches, and he's a true scholar. Professor Eddie Glaude Jr. joins me now. Welcome to Intercepted.
It's a pleasure to be here with you, Jeremy. It's my pleasure.
How do you see this particular moment that we're in the United States right now with Trump in power and the way that he is governing or not governing, and then the state of the Democratic Party?
Think of this moment as the decline of the empire, that something is dying while something is trying to be born. Donald Trump represents an exaggerated version of the rot that's at the heart of the country, that he's a reflection of something that's here. In some ways, all of the contradictions of a particular economic order, of the kind of exploitation of white fear, combined with a deepening sense of precarity, made Trump possible in some ways, right? And to the extent to which that's true, what we're seeing are those contradictions and those fears and anxieties in full color. So if people realize that the way in which they've imagined their lives, and I'm talking about everyday working people, white people, Black people, brown people, that they're working harder, but they're not making the kind of money that they should be, that wages have flatlined, that CEOs are making a killing off the backs of everyday ordinary folks, that we're as segregated and separated as we've ever been. And so the fundamentals of the country are such that it seems like this can't work. And typically in these sorts of moments, people scapegoat. people fall on their fears, right? So the reason why I'm not getting ahead, as it were, in Wisconsin is because big government is giving free things to people who aren't working hard, right? And they're the reason why we're not getting ahead. So we scapegoat undocumented workers. We scapegoat Black and brown people. So all of the contradictions are in full view. And at the same time that that's happening, people are trying to imagine the country differently. You have an opportunity for political realignment where the traditional labels of Republican and Democrat don't seem to work anymore, where the kind of traditional political dog whistles aren't as effective, at least among a certain cohort. And so there's possibility in the midst of this chaos, right? So, as James Baldwin said in his essay, and we're witnessing the death of the West as we knew it, the question is how long and how expensive the funeral will be. And so we're here now. And I think part of this death is the Democratic Party, Jeremy. I'm so tired of corporate liberals.
Well, I thank you for your question, but I have to say we're capitalist, and that's just the way it is. However, we do think.
This is really Republican light. I'm a country boy from Mississippi, and, I always have this view that when you give people a choice between a duck and something that acts like a duck, they're going to choose the duck. And there's a reason why Democrats have been losing a down ballot for so long is because they're trying to imitate something. They're not representing everyday ordinary people in the way they should. They're just big money politicians in some ways.
My concern is that if the Democrats don't realize that there's this growing tide, Black Lives Matter, immigrant rights movement, economic justice, that if there is this disconnect and the leaders of the Democratic Party actually manage to blow this moment to confront Trump institutionally, that it will result in a shattering of that party. And my sense is it might not be a bad thing, but it could, in the short term, aid in the consolidation of a sort of authoritarian power structure from an extreme right-wing political force in this country, plus Donald Trump, who's his own beast.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. It seems to me that the Democratic Party has been preoccupied with a particular kind of voter, Jeremy. They want to get this white working class voter back. And so because there's this sense that you can take for granted your base, right? There's no other place where Black folk can go. There's really no other place where young progressives can go. Democrats can then focus all of their energy on appealing to this middle class or working class white worker or the middle class suburban white mom. And to the extent to which they take for granted this particular segment of its base, those folks are then demobilized because they're not interested. They don't see the party representing their interest. And so many times folks not turning out to vote is an active political choice because they don't find that the political actors in front of them will actually benefit their lives or do anything for them. And what's interesting to me about this is that you're absolutely right in the sense that the Democrats' continued kind of pursuit of that line of argument or that particular political strategy actually colludes with the authoritarian shift because they won't stand in a very radical position. And in some ways, we have to interrogate why they are not engaged in a much more radical articulation of what's wrong with the country.
Why do you think that is?
Because they're in cahoots with big money. We need to be very, very clear. Clintonism and its various iterations, I think, has a deep and very, very problematic relationship with Wall Street, with corporate America. And we can tell a story about the Democratic Party's shift from unions and their support to Wall Street and their support. The current economic regime, the current political regime is not just simply a Republican story. Democrats are involved in it. And so if we're going to radicalize the moment, we have to push it from below. And what you see is that the Democrats, at least the Democratic leadership, tend to believe that resistance to Trump is sufficient, when in fact, when we look on the ground, we see that it's much more than that. It's not just simply resistance to Trump, right? It's about addressing the material conditions of everyday people. Folks want a livable wage. Folks don't want to go broke if they get sick, right? Folks don't want to be in perpetual war. And you see that there's this kind of ongoing activism that life as it is in this country is no longer sustainable. We need to imagine something otherwise. And as that is happening on the ground, Democrats and Republicans, people who are invested in the status quo, are trying to figure out how do we keep things as they are. And they're all going to get washed away in the result, I think.
And one of the things that I think is interesting is how many politically radical young people of color seem to now be running, and their first hurdle they have to clear is the Democratic Party itself.
Exactly. And it's not just simply young people of color. You see young women of color who are really stepping up and really offering a kind of progressive vision. And I think in some ways, Jeremy, they're trying to reclaim the word progressive and give it content. I mean, the political spectrum has narrowed in such a way that for some people in this country, Walter Mondale is radical. So you get a sense of the kind of political spectrum narrowing in such a way that it's almost unimaginable for some people to think of a kind of politics that actually extends beyond our current political options. When we look at these young folk who are pushing the Democratic Party, in fact, I think they're doing something a little bit more radical. It's not that they're pushing the Democratic Party. They're pushing the country. They're trying to put forward a vision of who we can be that is radically different than who we currently are. And if the Democratic Party stands in the way of this, and I get in trouble about this all the time because some people blame me regularly, Jeremy, for the election of Donald Trump because I said I would refuse to vote for Hillary Clinton. Some people still say that I can't critique Trump because I'm one of the reasons why he got elected.
In the eyes of some really rabid sort of ultra-partisan Clinton Democrats, that is, people like you are the big problem. Bernie Sanders is the problem.
As opposed to us trying to make the argument that we had an opportunity in that moment to really imagine ourselves otherwise, to break loose from the kind of political ideology that had overdetermined the Democratic Party and had defined it even through the Obama years as people were so excited about having a black man in the White House and oftentimes not paying attention to the policies. People are so upset with Trump and his immigration policies. Well, Obama was deporter in chief. We can begin to talk about Trump and his foreign the drone policy of the Obama administration. I mean, we can just go down the line. And so we had an opportunity to really, break open. And young folk across the country, I think, were interested in doing this. And we saw the powers that be within the party try to silence it. If they try it this time, they're going to be the reason why they lose. As long as the Democratic Party proceeds along this path, Jeremy, that party will bear responsibility for the likes of Donald Trump.
I've been listening to classic speeches throughout the Trump presidency. I sort of have gone back to listening to historic speeches, and I've listened to a lot of Malcolm X, particularly speeches analyzing the state of the Democratic and Republican parties. And one theme that runs through, and of course, I don't need to tell you this history, you teach it, is that with the overt white racists, you know what you're getting because they wear it on their sleeves.
There are many whites who are trying to solve the problem, but you never see them going under the label of liberals. That white person that you see calling himself a liberal is the most dangerous thing in the entire Western Hemisphere. He's the most deceitful. He's like a fox. And a fox is always more dangerous in the forest than the wolf. You can see the wolf coming. You know what he's up to. But the fox will fool you. He comes at you with his mouth shaped in such a way that even though you see his teeth, you think he's smiling and you take him for a friend.
And I sort of see that's what we're seeing with Trump. He is very pro, particularly cop on the street. He encourages them to slam the heads of people they're arresting into the car.
I said, please don't be too nice. Like when you guys put somebody in the car and you're protecting their head, the way you put their hand over. I said, you can take the hand away, okay?
Jeff Sessions talks about the Anglo heritage when he gives a speech in front of all of these sheriffs.
The office of sheriff is a critical part of the Anglo-American heritage of law enforcement.
How much of our anger and our concern should be about the unique threats posed by Trump versus, wait a minute, everyone, wake up. This isn't just about him. This is a pattern. Do you understand? I'm asking you a technical question. How do we sift through what part of this is because we have a white nationalist in the White House and is encouraging this, and how much of it is this is a serious ongoing problem in America under both Democrats and Republicans?
I think it's the latter. I mean, you hit it right on the head. I remember tweeting at some point that as we continue to fixate on Trump and the circus he commands, that we needed to remember that he was only a severe symptom of what was wrong with our democracy. Much more work is required of us than just simply resisting him. And that's really important because, we tend to have this kind of soap opera kind of approach or melodramatic approach to our problems. That is to say, we want to find the easily identifiable evil people and the easily identifiable good people, which then allows you to excuse yourself from being complicit in the reproduction of all sorts of inequalities, right? I like to talk about racial habits, the way in which the value gap, that is this belief that white people matter more than others, animates so much of this country, organizes so much of our lives, and that to the extent to which that belief obtains, no matter what the inputs are, the outputs will be the same. So whether you have Democrats or Republicans in office, if you have this process of evaluation of who's valued more than others, then you're going to continue to reproduce this. And this is evidence, Jeremy, in our habits, not just simply an unconscious bias, because unconscious bias is a phrase. The idea of unconscious bias means that we're just doing this stuff and we don't really know it, and it's hard to hold us accountable for it. But habit talk is very different. If you have the habit of smoking cigarettes, you're still accountable for that habit, right? And you can change it. And you can change it by changing your external environment and changing your personal behavior. So the value gap is sustained by racial habits. And those racial habits are not the possession of simply loud racists. And I use this example when I talk around the country. I believe the planet is getting warmer. I think climate change is real. But if you look at my day-to-day choices, you would think that I was a climate denier, because of the light bulbs I use, the kind of car I drive, right? Just some of the basic choices I make. And so you have people who say that I'm not racist, but then you look at the ways in which they live their lives, how they decide to choose, where they choose to send their kids to school, where they choose to live, the kind of micro decisions that are being made every day that's reproducing inequality. And it's very difficult to get at that when we're just looking at bad people and good people, right? The bad racist over here and the good liberals over here. And then you could say when the Republicans are in office, see, they're the bad racists. And when the Democrats are in office, they're the good liberals. When in fact, when it comes to policing, under both parties, right, black people and brown people and poor people are catching hell. They're over-surveilled and underprotected. So when we fixate on Trump, he becomes the kind of avatar of all of our ugliness, and we can absolve ourselves of the ugliness that we're participating in daily. When in fact, what is required of us is to look ourselves squarely in the face and look at all of those micro practices, those daily practices in terms of how we're funding schools and how we're okay with the fact that some of our children are going to schools that are utterly failing our children and others are going to school where they're getting opportunities that will set them up for life. How we're talking about the ways in which people are literally being socialized from the moment they're born to the moment they graduate high school, if they graduate high school, to become prophets for private prisons. And we can go on and on and on and on to show how in our day-to-day lives, we're reproducing a society that is fundamentally racist and fundamentally unequal in so many ways.
Having said all of that, what is unique about Trump, or what is something that you think rises to the level of, wait a minute here, this is not even normal considering our understanding of how bad the system is in this country? Like, what would you identify as issues that you think are sort of code red involving Trump?
The fundamental thing is that we thought that the George Wallace strand of American politics was dead. And, from George Wallace to Pat Buchanan to Donald Trump, right? And what's interesting is that particular strand of American politics has become mainstream. The fringe, those white identity nationalists who are living in the mountains in Washington and in Western Pennsylvania, right? They're now at the heart, at the center of the political party that has control over the country. And to my mind, that is surprising in the sense that I grew up in a moment in which, racial code words, dog whistles, with kind of political lexicon. Now it's just foghorns. People don't dog whistle. They just say it and activate all sorts of fears. And you combine that with the fact that the contradictions of neoliberalism are in full view. And what do I mean by that? That it used to be the case that whiteness could protect you from the onrush of economic precarity, that you could be poor, but, at least you weren't those folks, right? Now it seems as if white elites don't give a damn about poor white people. And so even as they're being mobilized by way of their fears, they're falling deeper and deeper into a precarious circumstance. folks are deeply afraid, right? And they're being profoundly nativist and racist. Those are the conditions for a powder keg that could explode. Or they're going to engage in foreign wars to divert our attention from what is the powder keg. To my mind, it's just carnage on the horizon unless we mobilize and organize.
You know, Eddie, when I watched the horrifying, despicable scene that was videotaped in the beating of DeAndre Harris in a garage in a building that was adjacent to the Charlottesville Police Department, I'm horrified at seeing overt Nazis beating a black man with weapons, but I couldn't help but imagine the scene from when I was a much younger man of watching Rodney King being beaten by the police. And for me, those two scenes juxtaposed raise serious questions for us in our society. Is it more outrageous when a neo-Nazi mob of non-badged individuals beat a black man, or is it worse when those with the badges are doing it? Because we're seeing both of those on a regular basis. And I wonder about our morality when we face the violence of the state versus the violence of a mob that acts as a sort of proxy for the ideology of those in power right now. I find myself often wondering where do we put the energy? Because we have a pandemic issue of police killing young black people in this country, beating young people of color, and we also have neo-Nazis doing it. But, you know, I'm asking, like, with so much disgusting, despicable, violent criminal action from those wearing the badges, how do we then decide which instance is sort of the worst or is the thing that we need to focus our energy on?
Of the two, there's only one group that has the authority to use deadly force. And so, you know, you have an entity, to use Althusser's language, right? This is the repressive state apparatus, right? Police have the authority, right, to use deadly force. And to the extent to which they are using it unjustly with regards to a population of folk, it seems to me that that's an issue that must be front and center, because it cuts to the heart of whether or not we're a democracy or not, right? And it's so easy to be horrified at neo-Nazis beating a black man in a garage. That's morally easy. It's much more difficult to say that what happened to Sterling Brown, the NBA basketball player, what happened to him is just simply indicative of a form of policing that devalues that person, that human being, because of the color of their skin. You would never, could you imagine that happening to a white NBA player? Could you imagine that happening to a regular white citizen? Right? It just doesn't come into view. And if it did, it would be so unusual that it would generate outrage. Or the police officer just recently in the Jersey Shore beating a white woman with his fist. So it seems to me that because police have the authority to use deadly force, and if they're using that force unjustly, they must be the object of concern for the citizenry. But because there's always the presumption that black folk are engaged in some form of criminality, that white fears are justified in relation to black bodies, that the police exercising force vis-a-vis these people, right, we must always, according to some, give them the benefit of the doubt, while those fellow citizens who happen to be black and brown, and in some instances poor and white, have to endure the authoritarian impulses of folks with badges, many of whom, as the FBI noted, because remember, the FBI said police forces throughout the country have been infiltrated by white nationalist forces, right? And then that just got swept under the rug. And then we have to, and then people like me, we have to raise our babies in the midst of this. We got to make sure that our sons and daughters can survive this. And what we see, Jeremy, over and over again is the American public being okay with it, which suggests to me that we're becoming moral monsters, right? Because we're okay with it. So the short answer to the question is that I think we have to focus on police violence. We have to, because they have the authority to kill us. And if we leave them unchecked, then we're well on our way to not only an authoritarian regime, but it's the worst forms of it.
To me, as we've seen this emerging narrative from Trump, where black players are sons of bitches, where he puts pressure on the exclusively white owners of NFL teams to force these players to stand or else face financial penalties or an end to their careers, the big message that I see being sent from the Trump White House is that I'm going to treat the most famous, the most wealthy, the most high profile, the most elite of the black race like dirt, like animals, and I am going to force them to bow down using the national anthem as a personal weapon against them. That's what Trump is doing. It's both a personal and a political weapon. But to me, that is sending a message to all black people in this country that I will do this to the most wealthy among you, the most elite among you, and I'll call their mothers bitches too.
There's a sense in this country that racial equality is a philanthropic enterprise, that it's a charitable thing that white people give to black people. And that it's not that these NFL players are the best at what they do in the world, right? They should be thankful that they're allowed to make millions of dollars. They should be thankful that we're giving them a chance to be millionaires, multimillionaires. And if they're not thankful, then we can call them and their moms whatever we want to call them. So racial equality is a gift that white folks give to black folks. That's the first mistake. Then you think about this as well. You know what's happening during the national anthem. Folks are drinking beer and buying hot dogs. You go up in the stands. Are folks sitting and standing in reverence? What are folk doing, milling about? So there's this kind of selective patriotism, right? There is this selective view of who can be patriots and who are patriots, and when is patriotism right to express, when is it appropriate to be expressed. So for some of Trump's ardent supporters, Cliven Bundy is a patriot, and the NFL players who are protesting are not. And then you think about this. Every time black people protest in this country, it becomes evidence for a certain segment of the country that we're not loyal. Ever since the Haitian Revolution, there has been an ongoing fear that black folk were going to revolt, right? And Haiti's been paying the cost ever since. But there's been this fear that black slaves would rebel, that even the person who was cooking in your home would somehow poison you, that there was this sense that given the oppression that they faced, that white Americans knew that black folk did not like, or even more strongly, hated white folk. And that this all we needed to do was see certain behavior to reveal the truth behind their mask. So whenever black people protest, even today, it becomes emblematic of their disloyalty. Even when we're protesting to make the country live up to what it just simply put on paper. So what Trump is doing, outside of those things I've just listed, is playing the culture war. So this is going to hit in August and September. Some black NFL players will have to make a decision. 70% of the NFL, I think, is black. They will have to make a collective decision how they're going to behave. If they choose to continue to kneel, it's going to happen right in the run-up to the midterms. And Trump will have his culture war to activate his base, to appeal to white fears, to appeal to ugliness, deep racism in the country as a way of mobilizing the electorate and getting his base out. But in the interim, what we see is the cynical nature of racial politics in this country. But I tell you now, there are some of us who love the country enough to criticize it relentlessly and without blinking. And that's not about disloyalty at all. It's about trying to imagine a new kingdom where justice is actually real for all Americans.
Well, on that note, I want to thank you very much, Professor Eddie Glaude, Jr., for joining us here on Intercepted.
It's my pleasure. Thank you so much.
Professor Eddie Glaude, Jr. is the William S. Todd Professor of Religion and African American Studies at Princeton University. And he's also chair of the Department of African American Studies there. He is the author of a number of books, among them Democracy in Black, How Race Still Enslaves the American Soul, and In Shade of Blue, Pragmatism and the Politics of Black America.